Life in Versailles at the time of Louis XIV. The Palace of Versailles was built by Louis XIV, expanding on a hunting lodge and private retreat that Louis XIII had located in Versailles on the outskirts of Paris. The palace was built as an extravagant complex and the greatest example of Baroque architecture in France. The palace is surrounded by gardens that are closely related to the architecture of the buildings. The gardens were designed for the amusement of the court and were the backdrop for endless festivities. There are pavilions, plant architecture, stairways, terraces, and monumental fountains that expand the visual perception of space. Both the palace and the gardens were created not only as places of amusement, but to symbolize the new order of the state. The Hall of Mirrors. The Hall of Mirrors is one of the most magnificent rooms in Versailles. It was called the Grand Gallery in the 17th century. In the time of Louis XIV, the king crossed this hall to go to his grand apartment, always followed by his courtiers. A crowd gathered along the passage to see the king walk by. Lebrun, its designers, painted 30 compositions in its arch to illustrate the glory of Louis XIV during his first 18 years of government. There are 357 mirrors decorating the 17 arches opposite T windows. This room was used for ceremonies only on special occasions, such as the weddings of royal princes or the receptions of grand dignitaries from foreign countries. King Louis XIV inherited the crown when he was 4 years old. The people behind King Louis XIV were mainly his mother, Anne of Austria, who served as regent assisted by her minister and confidant, Cardinal Jules Mazarin. Between them, they introduced policies that consolidated the power of the monarchy. After Mazarin died, Louis decided to rule without a chief of minister, and he declared himself a direct representative of God with a divine right to absolute power. He chose the sun as his emblem and was known as the Sun King. He uttered the famous words, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. Louis XIV implemented reforms that disempowered the nobles while at the same time making them participant in the daily life of the court. He used ceremony, pageantry, and etiquette to keep the nobility entertained. His first marriage was to his cousin Marie-Thérèse, daughter of the King of Spain, Philip IV. His second wife was the Marquis de Maintenon, who he married after the death of Marie-Thérèse. The women in the reign of Louis XIV. In this picture you see him and Marie-Thérèse getting married. Queen Marie-Therese slept in her own chambers in the palace called the Queen's Chambers, and the king visited every time he wanted to spend the night. Here in the picture is depicted the room of Marie-Therese. She received courtiers during and after her toilette, and even gave birth in public. She had 5 children, but only one survived. And in the picture is her son that survived. Queen Marie-Therese did not take part in the affairs of the state. She was not interested and preferred to play cards. Following her death, the king secretly married the woman whom he had been having an affair for some time, Françoise d'Aubigné, Madame de Maintenon. She was the caretaker of the illegitimate children of the king and his previous mistress, Madame de Montespan. The king gave his second wife the title of Marquise de Maintenon because she was a commoner. The marriage was never acknowledged. Louis XIV relied on her for counsel since she was interested in the affairs of the state and concerned with the plight of those in need. At the time of Louis XIV, women were not acknowledged as in control of power. Even Louis's mother had to reign in company of a male, Cardinal Mazarin. Women gained power either through birthright, allowing them to marry powerful men, or as the mistresses of powerful men. They were officially kept out of most important decisions of state. The king was a symbol of absolute power, and ceremony and celebration surrounded his life. Many French designers and craftsmen contributed to Versailles' architecture and garden, including André Le Nôtre, Charles Le Brun, Louis Lavaux, and Mansart, who created a mini-renaissance of interior design and decorative art during the 17th and 18th centuries. The palace housed the king and the entire French royal court, a total of about 3,000 residents. Louis XIV decided to bring the entire royal court to Versailles in 1682 in order to exercise greater control over his nobles and reinforce an all-powerful absolute monarchy. The king and his court. The king lived surrounded by many members of the nobility. Strict rules of conduct and etiquette had to be followed in the daily life at Versailles. Rules determined who was allowed to approach the important people in the court, where they would sit, and when they would speak. For example, only the king had the right to use an armchair. Simple chairs were assigned to members of his family, stools to noble people according to rank, and so on. The king's day was timed down to the last minute, from the rising ceremony to the retiring. He was attended by courtiers, and there was little privacy. For the first levée, which is his awakening, doctors, familiars, and a few favorites followed in succession into the bedchamber of the king to see him get washed, combed, and shaved. After that came the grand levée, when the king was dressed and had breakfast. Only the most important personalities were admitted to observe this ritual, but there were about 100 men most times. At 10 a.m., the king left his apartments, followed by the courtiers, and went to Mass at the royal chapel for 30 minutes. A choir sang a new work each day for the king's pleasure. At 11, the king held council in his cabinet. Different days were devoted to different topics, like matters of finance, state, domestic affairs, and so on. At 1 p.m., in his bedchamber, the king dined alone, sitting at a table facing the windows. Sometimes he received favorites as well. At 2 p.m., the king announced his plans for the afternoon. He might go for a promenade in the gardens, either on foot or in a carriage with the ladies. He may also go hunting, which was his favorite sport. At 6 p.m., he would have indoor entertainment while signing letters prepared by his secretaries. He would then go to the apartments of his favorite, Madame de Maintenon, while studying information given by his secretaries of state. At 10 p.m., the king would have the grand public supper. He would sit at a table surrounded by his family and then walk through to his bedroom and into the salon to salute the ladies of the court. Then he drew to his cabinet to talk to his family and a few close acquaintances. At 11:30, there was the retiring, which was a public ceremony when the king withdrew to his bedroom. Entertainment in Versailles. As form of entertainment, cards and gambling were very big at Versailles. Not everybody played, but many watched. 3 nights a week, there are receptions called apartment evenings, with tables full of food and drink in one room, billiards, as you can see in the picture here, in another room, and gaming tables in another. Musicians were playing as well throughout the night, like you could see in this picture. On New Year's Day, the king, the queen, and the royal prince and princesses distributed gifts to people of the court as a sign of their friendship. These gifts included gold snuff boxes, diamonds, necklaces, rings, etc. Dining at Versailles. Silver and gold plates held delicious dishes at Versailles. The main meal of the day was always a symbol of power in the French court. Etiquette decreed that the king should invite the queen, his children, and grandchildren to his meal. For the lesser service, which could be lunch, the king ate alone. The dishes were brought to the table in waves known as services. After the soup and appetizer service came, the roast meats and the salads, then the desserts and finally the fruit, with each wave, a new group of officers of the household came to serve the dishes. The hot drink in fashion was chocolate, which was brought to France from Spain and the Americas, and in this picture you could see a woman drinking her hot chocolate. The Grand Divertissement Royal. This was a major festivity during the time of King Louis XIV that took place on July 18, 1668, to celebrate the success of the peace treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The king spent the then enormous amount of 117 livres. It was held in the gardens, and it was a promenade full of pomp and surprises. The king opened the celebration by visiting his latest addition to the Versailles Gardens, the Dragon Pool and Fountain, which is in the picture. Then he invited everyone to a meal in the Star Grove. After that, everyone went in carriages to another part of the gardens to watch a play by Molière. The play was performed in a stage lit up by 32 crystal chandeliers in a tent made up with blue canvas cloth with a fleur-de-lis pattern. After that, there was another meal set up at a table around a fountain. Following the meal, a ball was celebrated in an area reached through a gallery of greenery closed by a grotto, and the day ended with fireworks. The nobility and the courtiers. From 3,000 to 10,000 people crowded around Louis XIV at Versailles. Some were there by birthright, some to carry out a task, and some were there by necessity. The courtiers had to follow strict rules set to filter their presence around the king. Every person had a role to fulfill when assisting the king. Serving him made it easier to gain his ear and his favor. One courtier may place a cravat around the king's neck, but another one had the function of tying it. The king appointed different groups of ministers to deal with different aspects of his affairs. He called them the King's Council. There was a high council made up of ministers of state. He met with them 3 times a week to deal with internal and external policy. There was the Council of the Interior. The king's brothers and other male family members participated in this council, as well as the royal prince, the Dauphin. There was a council of finance to deal with money matters, and there was a council of conscience made up of the king and his confessor, and only a few trusted men in key positions participated. Its role was to distribute benefits through the church. Fashion. It is said that part of the motivation of Louis XIV to stress fashion as his social edict was to keep his nobles occupied with looking the part and distract them from rebelling against him. In the picture, you can see people at the time of Versailles during Louis XIV and how they would dress. For whatever reason, Louis XIV has been credited with creating the importance of France in the decorative, textile, and clothing industries. One of his ministers said, "Fashions were to France what the mines of Peru were to Spain." During the king's reign, 1/3 of Parisians were employed in the clothing and textile trades, because he ordered that everything that could be produced in France would not be imported. Louis required a different code of dress for each formal event. His court created the carousel, which was a festivity in which various groups of nobles had to be dressed in the most extravagant costumes they could think of and parade around the gardens and palace. The king designed a blue silk jacket called Justaucorps à brevet, embroidered in silver and gold, which he only allowed special courtiers to wear. Only 50 nobles at a time were allowed to wear it. In the picture, obviously without color, you can see the Justaucorps brevet. One of the few surviving fashion objects of this period is the mule slipper. At the time, they were made of leather or silk, and they were embroidered with different colors. Here you can see that people still wear the mule today. Dresses for women had trains, but even the length of the train was dictated by etiquette. Hats for women and men were tall and over-decorated with feathers and flowers. I think Louis XIV was an important character, not only in French history, but in the history of fashion.